Hello, coming to you from the jolly city of board gaming, Omaha, Nebraska. Welcome to the Out of the Dust podcast. I'm your host, Santa Bryce, and ho ho ho! Tied with the popular recurring Out of the Dust geek list on Board Game Geek, the Out of the Dust podcast is a bi-weekly podcast that is focused on re-exploring games we played that we hadn't previously played in a year or more. Why did the game get dusty? Why did you decide to dust it off? How does the game compare to how you remembered it? Are you likely to play it more often in the future? These are the questions that we're interested in examining on Out of the Dust. This week on the podcast, episode 78. On the Out of the Dust segment, I'll bring Blackout Hong Kong out of the dust, and a contributor will dust off Labyrinth, the War on Terror. On the reaction segment, I discuss a trio of upcoming 2021 train games. On the What I've Been Playing segment, I review Castles of Tuscany. On the Obscure Bryce game segment, I review Expancity. And we wrap up the episode by continuing a series of expansion reviews with Wingspan, Oceania. I had a chance to bring Blackout Hong Kong, a 2018 game from designer Alexander Pfister and publisher Stronghold, out of the dust recently. I last played it 1 year, 6 months, and 17 days ago, shortly after it initially came out. I remember enjoying my initial play of this a year and a half ago, and it even made a positive enough impression on me that I made it my favorite new to me of that month. I put it on my wish list, and since it's been on sale for crazy good prices all over the place ever since its release, it was an easy one to add to the collection. But it's been languishing on my unplayed shelf for a while. I know it had a solo campaign, and if previous Pfister solo campaigns were any indication, I suspected I wouldn't be able to stop playing this one once I started, and wanted to wrap up some other solo games first. But eventually that happened, and I had some time to reacquaint myself with the rules this month, and started going through the solo campaign, which was just as addicting as I thought it would be. In fact, the game is better than I remember it being. The solo campaign missions are tough and challenging and keep bringing me back for more. It became my most played game in November and might win that title again in December as I struggle with the last few missions. That's moving up my ranking of Pfister games, and I might put it behind only Expedition to Newdale and Maracaibo at this point. The game has always gotten some criticism for its unrealistic theme that sees a city descend into pandemonium because of a blackout, but I find the wacky theme charming and find myself really getting into the game. There's certainly no denying the engaging mechanics of manipulating the resource dice with card-based combos, building one's hand up, exploring the map, and unlocking strategic bonuses. I think I'm going to plan on teaching my wife this one as soon as we're done with our Maracaibo campaign, too. Let's see what a contributor brought out of the dust. Brandon M., username JB Moby, brought Labyrinth, the War on Terror, 2001 to ? Out of the dust recently. Labyrinth, designed by Volko Ruhnke, one of the most significant wargame designers working in the industry today, is a card-driven wargame published by GMT in 2010. Brandon last played it 8 years, 4 months, and 15 days ago. He writes, 8 years? How did this sit on my shelf for over 8 years? Well, I sold it after about 2 years when my 2-player wargame regular opponent moved away. I wasn't interested in playing solo, and I didn't see the point of keeping a game that no one was interested in. Then a couple of years ago I bought another copy because I kept seeing that its solo mode was well regarded, and the designer's coin series was really starting to interest me. So this copy has only really been getting dusty for 2 years. In these COVID times, the game with the player count of 1 is king, and Labyrinth has a pretty great solo AI that operates using a flowchart. It is unforgiving! It is on the human player to manage the AI's potential for damage as you piece together a network of allies and keep the troop count as low as possible to maximize your hand size and have an answer to the bot's late round plays. It really is quite good, and I welcome it back to the table with open arms. Thanks for the contribution, Brandon. Wargames don't typically jump to people's minds when we talk about soloable games, so I know a lot of people will appreciate hearing what you thought of Labyrinth's system. Reaction segment time. This episode on the reaction segment, I react to a trio of recent 2021 train game announcements. First, there's Luzon Rails, the latest game in the Cube Rail series from designer Robin David. This was a Kickstarter that recently funded and expected to be fulfilled in 2021. I've yet to be impressed by any of the games in the Cube Rail series, generally finding them uninteresting and lacking interesting decisions. So I didn't back this one, but find myself more interested in it post-campaign. In a thread on BGG, the designer describes some of the things that would set the game apart from other Cube Rails games, namely a card-driven action system. Cube Rails games feel pretty scripted to me, so this element of variability sounds refreshing and engaging. I'm still not planning on picking this game up for myself after it becomes generally available, but it's one I'm tentatively interested in sitting down and joining a game if the opportunity arises sometime in the future. One I did back is The Transcontinental from first-time designer Glenn Dresser, which just concluded its campaign. I do enjoy most train games, but I must confess that this one attracted my attention because it looks completely different than any other train game. It's a very eye-catching game, and the linear worker placement mechanism sounds innovative and fascinating. The combination of the promised unique worker placement mechanism, pick up and deliver, and auction mechanics sounds like tons of fun. I'm interested to see what the game serves up for solo play too, which is something not a lot of train games feature. Definitely looking forward to this one being fulfilled. But the one I'm most excited about is a standalone expansion for On the Underground, featuring maps of Paris and New York. I love On the Underground. It's going to be one of my top new-to-me games of 2020. It further stands out as the last game I played at the local board game cafe before they had to close temporarily when the pandemic was gearing up in March. It's got a great solo mode I need to return to sometime, and I'm sad I haven't had a chance to get it to the table either solo or multiplayer since then. It's an elegant design, and I like the subtle but significant differences each map features. With that in mind, I'm really looking forward to seeing what the publisher, Ludi Creations, and designer Sebastian Bleasdale does with the system on these new maps. As of right now, this might be my most anticipated Kickstarter of 2021. This week on the What I've Been Playing segment, I'm going to tell you about Castles of Tuscany, the new tile-laying game from the great Stefan Feld and publisher Alia. Naturally, as a big box Feld game, this was one of my most anticipated games of the year, and I placed a pre-order for it with the local board game cafe at the earliest opportunity and picked it up right away when it came in. As you might recall, when I mentioned the game in a reaction segment earlier in the year, while most took the title of the game to indicate that this was going to be a sequel to Castles of Burgundy, I cautioned people against this belief and pointed out some examples of Feld games that were nothing like their similarly named predecessors, and imagined a scenario where this game would probably be a completely separate entity compared to the more famous Castles of Burgundy. Well, reality wound up falling somewhere in the middle, as we will see. While the game does share a thematic commonality and a similarity of the broad general mechanic of placing hexagonal tiles on different colored terrain hexes and having exciting things happen when that occurs, the details of how that occurs is indeed dramatically different. At the end of the day, it's not unfair to compare the games, but Castles of Tuscany does ultimately feel like a different experience. With that in mind, here's how it works. On their turn, a player must choose between 3 action options. Action option number 1 is to take a hex tile, which comes in one of 8 different colors, onto the staging area of their player board. Action option number 2 is to draw more terrain cards into their hand, for which there is no size limit. Action option number 3 is to use those terrain cards to place a hex tile from their staging area into their region, which is composed of 3 randomly selected interlocking tiles made up of several colored hexes each. Color uniformity is important, and a player must play 2 of the same colored terrain card to put a matching color hex tile into a matching colored hex in their region, obeying rules of adjacency. 2 cards of a different pair can substitute for 1 card of the desired pair. Depending on the color of the hex tile placed, players will then receive a reward of some kind, which might be additional cards, workers, which can replace needed cards on future actions, marble, which can be spent on additional actions, wooden hexes, which are wild colored for placement purposes, special ability tiles, which increase card drawing power and the number of workers and marble acquired at a time, or straight up points. Completing a connected area of the same color grants more points, and doing so before other players grants more points still. These points are tracked on a green point track, which acts as point income essentially when scoring is triggered at the end of each of the 3 rounds. Each time point income is triggered, those are added to a red point track holding the highest position on which determines who wins the game when the final round expires. Players replace hexes they take from the communal display with a personal supply of hexes divided into 3 stacks. Scoring the green income point track is triggered each time a player empties one of these 3 stacks for the first time. It's a fairly straightforward game, and thanks to the trademark excellent Alia rulebook, which are generally some of my favorite, the game was easy to learn and teach. It feels comparable in weight to Castles of Burgundy, but I'd hate to compare the fun value between the two, Castles of Burgundy is one of my top 10 games of all time, and it's just not fair to compare anything else to it. It would be a tall order for anything to surpass it, but I do certainly enjoy what Castles of Tuscany offers. Manipulating dice is one thing, but manipulating card draws is another thing entirely. Despite there being no hand size limit, hand management is super important in determining the most effective way to chain together tile acquisitions, card draws, and card trigger tile plays is a fun puzzle. Naturally, it would always be nice to play a single pair of cards to play a tile, but that's just not going to happen. So deciding when to make less efficient card and tile plays in order to trigger effects faster or at more advantageous times becomes the key strategy that the game revolves around. There's some nice tension built in too as players try to get just one more thing done before the scoring round triggers. If you like Castles of Burgundy, I think you'll like Castles of Tuscany too and find them sufficiently different in experience to include both in your collection. As for me, I'm a fan. Compared to his other 2020 release, I do like Bonfire more overall, but Castles of Tuscany will also likely appear in my top 10 of the year list at the end of the year. Obscure Bryce game segment time. This week on this segment, I'm going to tell you about Expancity, a 2018 city-building tile-laying game from publisher Breaking Games and designer Alex Cutler. This was quite the controversial game when it released a couple of years ago, because it got caught up in the Jeremy Hambly Gen Con controversy due to the Assaulter's loose affiliation with the publisher and designer. It's tough to say if the controversy resulted in more plays at its release or not, but it's certainly faded into obscurity since then and is only garnering a handful of plays a month currently. I didn't pay much attention to it at the time myself because city building isn't my favorite theme, but a friend of mine bought the game upon its release and I helped him try it out. I wasn't too impressed with it then and didn't intend on ever playing it again, but then another of my friends expressed interest in learning the game and I grudgingly agreed to join in the hopes that the game would be better at 3 players than my initial 2-player letdown. But was it? Here's how it works. At the beginning of their turn, a player is required to place 1 square city tile, which comes in building space or special space varieties, adjacent to another in play. Players get 3 action points to allot a turn between taking a building block from the general stock into the personal stock or placing a building block from their personal stock onto a building space on the board. Building spaces come in residential or commercial varieties, with residential building capped at 3 stories tall and commercial buildings needing a minimum of 4 stories before they can be capped. Players can only have 4 buildings under construction at a time, and at the end of their turn, they can choose to cap any eligible buildings they desire, with the caveat being that in order to cap a building of a certain height, they must have previously capped a building 1 story smaller. When a building is capped, the player gets to draw a couple of building objective cards and choose one to keep. These building objective cards grant players immediate points when they fulfill the requirements of them, which might be things like building next to certain special city tiles or building a certain number of buildings a certain height. A player concludes their turn by drawing another city tile into hand, and the game concludes when all 60 city tiles are drawn, at which point communal objectives are scored. When I played this game 2-player a couple of years ago, it was a tedious, repetitious experience. 60 tiles, or 30 turns each, was way too many. It was a little bit better at my more recent 3-player experience. 20 turns each didn't feel quite so tedious, but the gameplay still felt repetitious. There's really not anything that happens in the game to mix things up. Build in the most desirable locations one can, work toward the objective cards you have, fulfill them, and repeat. The objective cards are problematic because they vary vastly in points and difficulty and create a very swingy experience. You are either drawn to something you can use, or you don't. Drawing a pair of impossible-to-fulfill objectives will happen several times in a game. The components are decent, the building blocks make for some nice table presence as the game progresses, but the tiles they're placed on and next to feature some ugly and uninspired, bland clip art-esque art. All things considered, since the 3-player game was a little more interesting, I think I'll bump up my initial rating slightly from one of the most disappointing games of the year I played that year to thoroughly average and forgettable in every way. So not one I'm planning on adding to my wish list, and still not one I'm interested in playing again, but I suppose I might be able to be talked into a 4-player game sometime to see if that's the sweet spot for the game, and only if there's nothing else anyone wants to play instead. this week I continue my review of 2020 expansions with Wingspan, Oceania, the new freshly released expansion for the hit Wingspan from designer Elizabeth Hargrave and publisher Stonemaier. I'm a Wingspan fan and quite enjoyed what the European expansion added to the game, so getting in a pre-order of Oceania was an easy decision. That came in recently and I was able to get it to the table right away. Like the European expansion, the main focus of Oceania is another generous stack of bird cards to add additional variety to the game and mix things up even more. As the name implies, most of the new birds are ocean-faring, island, and coastal species. New color bands denote new end-of-round and end-of-game abilities. A new food token, Nectar, is a wild token to take the place of other food when necessary and introduces a new scoring mechanic. As nectar is spent, it's stacked next to the corresponding row of the bird that needed it. At the end of the game, each row scores points for the players who spent the most nectar. The game includes newly designed player boards to remind players of the nectar scoring and provide spaces to stack it, and also changes up the optional action bonuses on some of the spaces to increase the engine building capability of players. New round-end scoring objective tokens and end-of-the-game objective cards are also included to further incorporate the new types of birds and what they do, and new gameplay elements. So Oceania winds up being a larger, more significant expansion than the European expansion was, due to these new components. All of these new additions are lots of fun and manage to increase the sense of engine building, which has always been Wingspan's strongest suit. I'm quite impressed with the expansion as it adds even more variety to an already highly replayable game. None of the new elements detract from the experience and indeed heighten the various gameplay parts already present without feeling like they're bloating the game or significantly altering the experience. It feels like a seamless expansion and was easy to integrate with the existing game and teach to others. It does overflow the base game box though, and you're going to need to use one of the expansion boxes to hold the extra components. If Stonemaier releases the next expansion in a big box to hold everything, I'd be okay with that. Until then, Oceania is definitely worth this very minor hassle. I wouldn't label it as an essential expansion, but it's certainly going to please fans of the game, and if that includes you, absolutely go pick this one up too. Well, that will do it for episode 78. Thanks for listening. Feel free to join the Out of the Dust Podcast Guild at BoardGameGeek.com. Follow the podcast on Twitter at OutOfTheDustBGG. Leave a comment at the Guild. PM me on BGG under user handle Radagast14 or user handle AndLee14. Or email me at radagast14@CenturyLink.net. And join the Out of the Dust conversation yourself at our monthly geek list at BGG. Alright, play me out, Ananda!